So I heard somebody dropped a new program recently.
Really? Where? Do you know who it was?
Yeah, you doofus.
Oh, I forgot about that. Yeah,
The BowTiedOx density program.
I am actually, for once, happy with the program I put out because, dude, it is so funny. I look back at the push pull legs when I did, bro. Like, I should be put in jail.
For the actual program or the design?
Oh, the program is awesome. The design, that should be a criminal offense. Like, I wonder how many like just eye issues I caused. I've caused ocular cancer just from the blue and the black. Oh, dude, you can't even read it.
You're the reason why those climate activists are like attacking like art museums
You can't
because
put that on me.
they're so offended by by the design of your PPL program.
I can't wait till. Have I said we're doing it yet? I think I have. How we're gonna remake it and actually make it viewable.
Oh, we're gonna redesign the push pull legs.
Yeah, it's your idea too, which is
That'll be exciting. Yeah, definitely, definitely.
so that leads us to where we are today on our 300th take of this. You know what's funny? As we get going, we're always we don't really make much mistakes on these things. Our introductions on these things are painful. Painful. Then it doesn't help that I'm like literally one of those just picky, like creative types. I'm like, all right, Mikey, just give me 5 minutes. I got to get into my zone.
Yeah, and then an hour later.
Dude, I never realized it because I've always viewed myself as more like a type A, like just can do like just work in that type of person. But I've slowly come to the realization that I am one of those like prima donna artist types that I'm like, oh, I'm not in the right headspace right now. Oh, I need to get into my creative zone. I have to do my process.
Mm.
And yeah, I don't like it. I wish I was like you that like we'll be like, hey, here's an idea. We need to do it. And you're like, cool. 15 minutes later, you're like, okay, cool. I'm already halfway done. I'm like, what? Like, I
Yeah,
haven't even thought about starting.
I jump in really quickly. It's part actually a part of me does it like actually cognitively because I know about like the being too perfectionist with things, like you just never get it done. So a part of me like slaps together usually something that's like like with any project, whether it be like creative or whatever, like I'll just slap something together, and like even if it doesn't come out great, I'll at least have had some momentum. So like for example, like with the like I'm doing a YouTube series, Road to Pro on YouTube, and it's me at the gym with my training partner. And the first bunch of episodes, I mean, like I look back and they're crap, but like I was under no illusion that they were good. I just knew that like we had to just get the ball rolling and doing it and doing it and doing it, and then like 10 episodes later, like they're actually pretty good.
Yeah. And you got to experience this is why we work really well together. You got to experience it with me on this program where and it ends up I wouldn't even call it like it's not a bug, it's a feature. The way that I need to be in these certain moods, these states to do it, because like this whole process, we ended up creating something really good. And what's funny is on paper, it just looks like, oh, cool. They slapped together some workouts, some whatever. I don't think people quite realize what goes into these things because we were debating like word choices, like single words. Like it's that methodical. And it's granted, it is to a degree, it is kind of like, okay, cool. Let's put some workout, like whatever. But it's the 10,000 hours of experience that both of us have all put together and going to these things. But yeah, it looks like, especially the first few days, like a neurotic mess.
Yeah, well, it's interesting though is that when you and I actually sit down to put together like every week's like programming, we may like from the outside looking in, it might look like just almost arbitrary how like we just be like, oh, what about this, what about that, what about this, and like this, okay, this and this. But what's actually happening is like you have like so much experience behind the scenes that like we just kind of know where to look, we know which questions to ask and sort of what decisions to make, that to like somebody from the outside might just be like, it might just look arbitrary, but
Yeah,
it's actually really well considered.
the attention to detail. I'm like, I know I'm like sitting here like patting myself on the back for this program, but there is just so much crazy attention to detail. Even you and our buddy pointed out, they're like, it's kind of crazy because I seem from the outside looking in, like I can be impulsive and all that, which I can be, but like everything I do to like the nth degree is like so calculated and methodical, almost to like a paralyzing degree. But like with these programs, it's not just like I said, slapping together some workouts, even the weekly updates. Like I know how the progression of this thing's going to go, but we sit there. It should take us 2 minutes to update the next week, but it turns into an hour because we're sitting here like, okay, well, what about this? Okay, well, maybe this week, like with this rep range, does it make sense with what we did last week? And maybe if we build upon it this way, and it's just, it gets really crazy. But that's what kind of, that's the theme of what we're talking about in this episode today. And then how you can apply it too is these just inner attention to details, these inner workings of how to actually design programming and a training plan that works best for you.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of times, while training programs like there's some training programs that are really like timeless. Like for example, like dog trap training, which kind of has like a resurgence lately. I mean, I don't know if you saw this, but like there was actually, I think it was like a study where they were talking about like stretch mediated hypertrophy or something like that, and like how there's just more evidence to suggest that that's like a really hypertrophic like thing to do or part of the lift. And it just kind of like all of our buddies are like pointing back to like dog crap and like how that's like a pretty old program now. And that's like there's so much of that stretch mediated like hypertrophy in that program. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that there are some programs that last, stand the test of time. But if you really want to get super personal with it and make your own programming, there are these considerations and principles that we are going to discuss today.
I can't wait. It was like a side tangent. We talked about it at some point this year. It might not be the next program, but I want to create the starting strength of bodybuilding. I want to create the timeless beginner program that you just have no idea what you're doing. You've never gone to the gym, but you want to start, or maybe you're newer to training, and I want it to be the like gold standard because starting strength is not like a hypertrophy based program. 531 is not a hypertrophy based program. You can get hypertrophy because newbies are going to get hypertrophy from anything they do in the gym, but I've never really seen one that I'm like, this is it. This is the gold standard for people that are new to the gym. So that's going to be my like, that's going to be like my magnum opus. And I want to come up with it, by the end of the year. But that's where these things we're talking about that really go into it, because what exercises are a beginner going to do versus what I would do, because we actually talked about this in the Discord in a voice chat, and it's kind of funny that I excel to an outlier degree on things like even bench press to a degree, but like deadlift and squat. And then my position on like programming those is very contradictory to that, because I personally, I will still do those, but it's not very often. Deadlifts, I don't do traditional deadlifts, or conventional, but I love straight leg type deadlifts and variations. But for me to go into the gym and just load up a deadlift and do a traditional deadlift, like that doesn't really ever happen. A back squat, again, that's just not really, I do those way more than I will deadlifts, but because it comes down to things like just the sheer load and the stimulus to fatigue that it's providing, and even just the safety of it, that once you start getting to this like 5 plate per side working set range, there's a lot more that goes into it and a lot more you have to consider. And then you have to consider, could I have done something else to get the same or even a better result with half the stress on the body, half the fatigue, and 1,000 times safer? So that's one of the first things that we want to talk about when it comes to your own training and how you can set it up, and the thought processes that go into these behind the scenes that maybe don't make sense when you look at it, but then once you think through, you're like, oh, okay, I get it.
Well, let me see what you think of this. I guess you could probably break down. this topic, which is exercise selection, which is probably the best place to start, I would say, right? With programming. Well, so, I guess if you were going to break it down into those three categories of like a total beginner or someone who's intermediate, someone who's more advanced, someone who's more beginner, there's some disagreement on this and there's like a case to be made for like many sides of it, but let me give you sort of what I think is a solid approach, which is if you're gonna like you said already, if you're gonna grow by like, like the joke is you'll grow by looking at the weight, as a beginner, like because it's like you're so ready to receive stimulus in those first couple of years that it's like whatever you do you're gonna grow. And so I view that as, well, because you have this free pass and this sort of grace period of these first couple of years, it's kind of like in your best interest to mix it up between lots of free weights and machines. And like machines, they can just kind of give you the most bang for your buck usually, but also you should probably be doing free weights because free weights also require you to sort of develop more. Um, it's more than just it's more you're lifting for more than just the stimulus. You're lifting to sort of get better at lifting the weights in general. Like you're just getting better at moving a weight through space, spatial awareness. There's a word for it that's escaping me, but if you remember it, let me know
It's
what it is.
not proprioception or
I think it is proprioception. Yeah,
proprioception. Yeah,
yeah.
but
So I just think that if you're gonna in the starting phases, you should probably get a good mix because down the line in your advanced uh, sort of intermediate to advanced, you just kind of want to have a big arsenal of like things you can do effectively. You don't want to enter your intermediate phase where you're only capable of using these machines or whatever, and now it's sort of like as you exit the beginner phase where you have all these newbie gains and the gains start to slow down. You don't want like a lack of exercise selection to even hamper you further. Does that make sense?
well, yeah, I couldn't have really said it better because that's why. Do I think you could just use machines the entire time and grow? Yeah, sure. Like, of course, you could do the same with free weights. You could do the same with anything, but it comes down to movement patterns. So free weights are pretty much the base movement pattern for everything. Like a squat is the base movement pattern for like a leg drive type leg movement, right? A deadlift is, I mean, a lot of people will call it a back exercise. I do think it does contribute to the back a lot more than a lot of people give it credit to, but to a degree, that's a very basic movement pattern. Then, like a press, a bench press, that is a very, very, that's the basis of all pressing, chest pressing movements. So if you take advantage of free weights and all that, you're going to actually neurally, like your brain is actually going to establish the skills, the movement skills to actually perform these exercises. And something that, and this is very contradicting for me to say, because normally I talk about how, oh my gosh, that just doesn't matter. But you do start to, as a beginner, things like stabilization. That is a real thing. Are your stabilizers getting worked on a free weight movement? Yes, but not to the degree of, or on a, sorry, on a machine movement. Yes, they're getting worked, but not to the degree that you will develop it on something like a bench press. You have to learn how to balance the bar, right? Keep the bar steady. You have to learn how to, not on a fixed plane, lower the weight, push the weight up, and not be, shaky and moving it around and all this stuff. So it requires you to learn these things. And it's a really good time to learn it because the load is not there to where it's dangerous. If you're just starting to learn how to like stabilize and do a bench press when you're already benching 225 pounds, that now you're getting to loads that you can really mess yourself up. If and where a lot of people will start is like literally the bar. Maybe a little bit more if you're lucky, but I think even when I started, it's pretty much just like the bar. um the weight isn't there, that this risk for catastrophic injury is significant. It's still, I mean, it's always going to be there, but it's way, 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 way lower. So you can start to develop these things, these these neural patterns. You can start to develop the movement skills, the motor skills. You can develop that stabilization of these weights, because I have had periods where I do mostly machine, mostly almost exclusively, and then I'll go to like, okay, cool, I'm going to do just like an incline barbell bench. and I'm super shaky. And I can tell actually what's limiting the lift is not the weight itself. It is more or less my ability to handle the weight. So that's why it's a good thing to learn. And even then, that's why I still, even though I'm like, there's better exercises to do, I do incorporate some like incline barbell work. I don't really do flat bench. I think the technical skill needed to do it well, do it safely, and avoid all the risk is just not worth the bang. So it'll be like incline barbell work. I'll still do some squat work, barbell squat, and I'll do some deadlift work, mostly again with the straight leg deads. But I still do those things because it's not a skill I want to regress. I want to maintain the integrity of the skill, so it's never an issue that I'm like, okay, cool, I can only work out of barbells now, and it's like, oh, I've completely lost my ability to really handle this.
Yeah, I even have this maybe controversial opinion that like, you'll even have a better, this might sound crazy to some people, but it's I believe it, like you might even have a better machine chest press if you're really good at something like a barbell press.
Oh no,
And
100%,
you know,
100%.
I just think like it's almost like I've used this example before. I come from a wrestling background, and in the off season, we would train like Olympic style, right? During the year, we would train what's called folk style, which is like the American like collegiate style of wrestling. And then in the summers, in the off season, it would be like Greco Roman, or it would be like Olympic or freestyle. In other words, eh, and what happened was I didn't want to train that way at first because I was like, I want to get good at Scholastic. Like, why would I train this whole other way? And my coach said to me, like, if you get good at freestyle, it will make you better at Scholastic. And like, it's not a 1-to-1. Well, it could actually, you could even say it may be a 1-to-1 comparison, but it ended up being true. Like, I learned all these new rules and, a whole nother way of approaching wrestling. And when I came back to Scholastic, I was way better. I was way better, and that could be for a lot of reasons. But there's something to the idea that getting good at something different or harder, and then coming back to like your bread and butter by choice, not by necessity, because you don't want to end up as somebody who's you know entering into your intermediate to advanced phase where like you've really never mastered a barbell press or a squat. And like there's something about being able to be good at that thing, being able to be really good at that thing, and then choosing like a leg press, for example. But that's a choice. And that's like an intelligent choice that you can make. But it's like, should you never develop the squat? Should you never develop the barbell? Like, I think it's a bad idea. But I guess, and also maybe we're getting a little farther away from the point. Although this is all part of the point, which is talking about exercise selection in your programming, and we're kind of laying out the considerations. Like what our discussion so far has been, like how we think about lifting weights and like which exercises to use and which ones not to use. And I think it's probably a good idea to get into sort of like you know, which order to get into to program your workouts in. So I think also maybe before we do that, I know I'm like there's like three tangents inside of three tangents, but before we get into that, maybe we should kind of lay out like roughly how long should your exercises be, and and then we can talk about like the exercise selection and exercise order. And I guess I'll just give you my opinion. I think anything above 20 sets in a workout, like 20 working sets in a workout, is probably going to get into the too long in the gym type of a world. So somewhere in that 20 sets, I think is where you should kind of, that's a good starting point. And now you fill it in with like your favorite exercises. Um, I know I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but are you kind of following where I'm going with this?
Yeah, I break it down more to like per body part though. But yeah,
Right.
for
Yeah,
a
no,
total
that's good.
workout, yeah, roughly 20 because it's my push day is we considered um the warm up chest fly as a working set. It's not really a working set in the grand scheme of things, even though it should be somewhat challenging, but even then I think we're pushing almost 20, which is the longest I would ever really program something. I think I could get away with less, which kind of comes down to something I'm actually writing about. We'll get way into this is the redundancy. Can I find a place where I'm for sure not doing too little but I'm also not doing too much that maybe you could tweak it a little bit and be a little better. But for the sake of redundancy, we're making sure we're checking all the boxes. So that's kind of where this falls, is kind of in that point of redundancy where maybe it could be slightly better, but it's sure as hell not hurting you. So that's, and then I wanted to back up just on the stimulus to fatigue thing one more time. And the point I wanted to make is you don't want to be a dumb meathead lifter. Like, you don't want to do that. Like, yes, it's simple and everything at the end of the day, but a lot of people never develop this ability to kind of navigate this with this nuance like we're doing. You don't, there's no space for dogmatism here. You can't be like, oh, only free weights, oh, only machines, only like, you're not using your head. Do not get married to a single MO. Figure out different methodologies, use different methodologies. Because again, to highlight the point that a beginner doing a 135-pound squat, and let's say they can get 10 reps, we'll call it six. They can get 6 reps to near failure. They're good. Where if I'm sitting there at my peak squat form, I'm sitting there like 5 plates per side. That's what, 485, 495. They're, even though on paper we both hit failure 6 reps, the amount of stress that would just put on my body to do those 6 reps versus the amount of stress that goes on your body for 6 reps at 135, even though on paper you're both the same, it's relatively should be close to the same thing because it's same rep, same point of failure. It's so different. It feels like it's 5 plates. Like, it's heavy. Like,
That beginner might be getting the same relative stimulus, but there is not a relative fatigue is probably a good way of putting it. Like, you're you're both receiving the stimulus you need to grow your legs, and it might be comparable relatively to one another, but in terms of fatigue, it's skyrockets when you put a big heavy barbell on your back. It doesn't matter how strong you are or how much experience you have, you're still undergoing what's called axial fatigue. And that's what that means, is like the fatigue on your spine, for example. And it's just such like an overwhelming experience. It could be hard for anybody at any level, but when you're talking about somebody who could lift like 500 pounds on their back, we're talking about like, well, now your programming is going to have to really change if you're gonna if you're set on doing heavy squats. Now the landscape of your programming for that day has to really adjust. Whereas for someone who's more of a beginner, they could probably work in like barbell squat and then like do some leg presses after, get some leg extensions, and maybe you could too, but maybe to a different degree. And maybe like they could do like 2 or 3 more other leg exercises. It's just it's the fatigue is just not it's way higher when you're talking at that level of
they
being
would
advanced.
they would even be able, that's why there's some beginner programs that are full body, and it'll literally be like bench, squat, and deadlift in the same day because they can do that. If I
Yeah,
did
right.
that, bro, I'd be dead. Like, I couldn't do
Yes.
it. And then
Yeah,
another
same.
thing that we talk about all the time, we talked about in a chat was, and I'd be remiss to not hit this point hard, is safety, risk of injury, and all that. So we'll take the same thing, that heavy squat. Just unracking it, there's a bunch of stress on the body, a bunch of fatigue. Then you got to sit there, make sure your feet are well in place. There's 1,000 things that can go wrong too, in terms of you straighten your leg a little bit too much, collapse on your leg. You just, you have to spend more time than you should have to like just make sure you're set up to properly execute the lift. Where that's why, like, then for someone like me, it's like, ooh, or do I just want to do a hack squat? Why I love that is because before I even have any weight on my body, I can have my feet perfect right where I want them. Right. I have my feet, angled out to the right degree I want them. I have them directly where I want in terms of placement on the platform, everything before the weight even hits. So I'm wasting no energy for that. All I have to do is unrack the weight and start doing my sets. Then another thing we were talking about is sometimes you might feel like, because squat, I don't like to take squat to failure. I want to stay a rep shy at least. So some days you feel like, oh man, I don't know if I can get another. And then you end up getting 4 more reps. And then, but there are some days you don't feel like you can get another and you can't, and you'll bury yourself, which can be dangerous on a squat if you don't bail correctly. So that's another thing where on a good leg press or a hack squat with the safety catch, I don't have to guess where failure was. I don't have to be like, oh, maybe I had one more. Because if you can safely bail out of the machine, with a safety catch, like cool, take it to failure. And that can be a big deal when it comes to, proximity to failure and things like that, and really progressing your lifts to make sure you're doing it the best you can. So even on a squat, you could say, oh, you got a spot or whatever. I watched a video, a guy just doing 405 pounds, and he had spotters and all that, and he died. He didn't bail correctly. The bar came down on his neck, and yeah, he died. So, and that's another thing that goes into this is like mentally, I feel so much better to attack my sets on something I know I'm safer at than something that there becomes a real risk at. Call me soft, call me whatever, but there's a real mental side of this where I know I can just attack this set to failure on a hack squat. Back squat, maybe I'm going to psych myself out and I'm going to get less reps than I could have just because I kind of psyched myself out. So that's to beat this dead horse on exercise selection. That's just some of the things you have to think about. And it's going to change as your training develops. As you get stronger and all that, you're probably not going to be able to rely on the same things you did when you've been lifting for a year, when you've been lifting for 10 years.
Yeah, and a good way of approaching this would be if you're really set on doing some like heavy barbell squats because maybe you just love them. Do it for a month, but keep in mind sort of, all of this. Keep in mind, the fatigue cost, the cognitive bandwidth that goes into walking out a heavy barbell and the safety concerns and all that. And then after a month, consider whether or not it was actually worth it. Maybe you could have gotten something more, you could have gotten better stimulus or equal stimulus for way less fatigue or way less cognitive bandwidth and way less risk of failure, and switch that in. And that's sort of what all this programming is about. It's like nothing is kind of set in stone. You don't have to stick with the same thing just because you've been sticking with it. You could switch things in, but do it intelligently.
Or
um, yeah.
you can even use your head a little bit more and then consider, okay, if I start out fresh in my workout and that's the first thing I do, I'm going to require all this weight. Or I can program it a few movements in. It can be kind of towards the back half of my workout. I'm not going to be pushing the same weight. I'm going to, for the same relative stimulus, my point of failure might be 500 pounds for 6 reps. Where if I do it later in my workout, now we're talking like 315. Like, because there's some times where you like it literally is a significant jump like that. If you do it first, you get all this weight. A few movements, you're a little smoked. Now you're working with less weight, which then that's going to be a safer movement on you. There's going to be less total fatigue because just the total tonnage is down. So that's even something to consider when it comes to manipulating. You still want to do squats, but maybe you want to do them in a way where it's a little safer. It's not going to be as taxing. It's like, cool, you can just kind of put it later in the workout. That's like one way, just, you know, with this concept of just using your head, don't be a meathead, actually think through what you're doing.
Yeah, we talked about this a couple episodes ago, or maybe it was our last episode. It's been so long. This concept of exercise order, that was a great segue. It's exactly right that you can, depending on what you start with and end with, you could have different outcomes. Maybe you need slightly more volume with one approach versus the other to get the same stimulus. But we're talking, your concern is not just stimulus. Your concern also is fatigue, and it's also safety. We're talking about longevity. Your programs really need to like have longevity in mind. If you're trying to just like get the craziest stimulus possible for like every day, like go crazy, it's like you're going to burn out in like a few weeks, and like your progress is probably going to stall out quicker than it would have, and you're probably going to have to deload a lot quicker. Like in the case of what Ox was just describing with using like the like a leg day, for example, if you start out with like leg extensions, move on to like a leg press, and then your third movement for the day is some barbell squats, like he said, you're not going to be lifting as much, and it's a lot safer at that point, but you're still hitting your failure points.
That's
So
why.
you could think of it like that, from like from this continuum from isolation to heavy compound, or compound to isolation. We've talked about this again before, but there are benefits to both. But these are some ideas when you are programming for yourself, like to consider.
That's like, and this is why I have a beef with a lot of exercise science literature, is because they look at immediates, they look at 12, 16 weeks of training, and they're not looking at the longevity of it. They're not looking at, okay, what if we kept on doing this for a year? And so that's where I get real poopy. And I'm like,
Some of
guys,
those.
Yeah,
52 set volume studies.
and people get married to those studies and like, no, look, the data shows this. And I'm like, dude, use your head. There's not enough using your head in the exercise science world. There's a lot of data boundness. They're not data based. They're not science based. They're science bound. So they're like, no, the data showed me this. And I'm like, dude, turn your nerd brain off for 2 seconds and let's think this through. Let's apply raw common sense and logic here. And let's zoom out for a year. How do you think this is going to play out doing this for a year when, okay, we could have done half that, but we're recovering better and all this? How does that play out? And I find a lot of times it'll be like, oh, I didn't think about that. That makes sense because I love data. I love all this stuff, but I value common sense infinitely more than I do about some study on untrained college kids. Infinitely more. But
Yeah, but let's get into I think rep ranges next because I think there's a lot more that goes into it than people might imagine. So first of all, I guess to just introduce the topic, you know, you can grow for hypertrophy anywhere from like the 6 roughly to 30 rep ranges. Ox and I both kind of agree that we top off at around 20 personally. It's our own preference. But inside of that, like let's say 6 to 20 rep range, you know, there's a lot of well, you're the way that we want to progress. So, like in terms of progressive overload, the way to of what we call beating the logbook has to do with progressing through a range. It's not just okay, do 10 reps of this, and then next week do 10 reps as well. But you have to increase the weight every week and stuff. You know that can work in some cases, but giving a rep range is actually a way of progressing. And so when you're building your own program, you have to know kind of like, well, what rep ranges and why and where and when. So let's get into that. So I think first question I guess for you is, um, let's explain the lower half of the rep ranges. Let's explain like a low rep range. Let's say like 6 to 9, for example. When would you program that and why? And I guess just expand on that.
so it's not really going to be based on, this isn't like a solid, like this type of movement, I'm doing this for low reps or whatever. But a big part of my philosophy here is working that lower rep range. One, it is still working hypertrophy. We're still in there, but it's definitely going to allow you to get stronger, more just raw strength than working higher rep ranges would be, which then can help us. And that's why I do like, as I think we went over last episode, like load sets and back off sets. So if I can get stronger and stronger working these 6 to 9 reps, and then now I'm doing it for 12 to 15 reps over time, because I am erring a little bit on the lower end of the rep range, and which is going to err on the side of some neural adaptations, which are just more strength based adaptations. I'm going to be able to do more weight in the 12 to 15 rep range. I'm going to be able to progress that because I'm building this raw strength, which is another thing that like data isn't really going to necessarily show you the downstream effects of that. But it's something logically to consider, because it's like, okay, if I build absolute strength, is that going to translate to progressive overload in different rep ranges? Which it's, the answer is going to be yes to that. So, and I just look a lot at movements. Like, does it make sense to do a pec deck for 6 to 9 reps? I mean, it could have its place, but it's like, I'm probably going to keep that 8 to 12, 12 to 15, even working 15 to 20 on that versus something like a incline bench or a machine chest press or whatever. It's like, I'm probably going to load that heavier just because it can provide more of that raw stimulus for strength and growth. That's then going to, if you get really, really good at a chest press, odds are you're going to be really, really good at a cable fly because your chest is now overall stronger. So by really getting stronger on these big bang for your buck movements, you're going to have more strength and be able to progressive overload better on these more isolation accessory movements. So typically I'll kind of err on the side of more compounds. We'll be working this lower rep range, but it has its place anywhere. It's one of those things you just have to kind of think through. It's like,
And you would put maybe the heavy compound more like towards the beginning of the program where you're a bit more fresh. I know we just talked about exercise order, but like in this case, like for chest, for example, you'd place that more in the beginning, and you'd place that like maybe after a warm up, for example, and then you would stick to a lower rep range because we were trying to also get like we're fresh and we can probably hit some really solid reps for 6 to 9 reps, and they can be really powerful reps. And so is am I kind of getting that right?
yeah, I think we even talked about it last episode. Was this these the compound isolation kind of progression there? I'm not married to the idea that later in the workout you have to be working higher reps. Like I still think there is a place where lower reps can make more sense. But generally, yeah, it's going to be the heavier compounds in the beginning and then lighter isolations. But that's not rule. Like I break that
Yeah, I
all the time.
agree. I agree. It's not like, but here's the thing though. It's not a rule, but it also kind of it's a useful rule because I think you and we're both, I'd say, more advanced, and I think for us breaking rules is sort of like a uh it's sort of like a rite of it's something that you can like you get the right to do once you've had enough experience where like kind of intuitively, and all the reasons for why you might break the rules. But I think it's actually a solid rule. Like I'd actually put my foot down and say, as a general rule, or as a general guideline, I should say, I wouldn't say a rule, but as a guideline, I think it does make sense to start with the lower rep ranges and then sort of finish off with the higher. Again, it's not something I'm married to. I don't want to belabor the point, but I think it just makes sense on paper because as you move towards the end of your exercise, your session, you're the likelihood that you're going to be able to push quality sets in that lower rep range to failure, I think goes down. Because like let's say we're at the lower end of the rep range, 6 reps, right? And I'm asking you to do like a dumbbell press towards the end of your exercise after you've done 2 compounds, other presses, and let's say you're still at that bottom half of the rep range and it's 6, right? The likelihood that those 6 are going to be really good, good enough. It to me, I think you have a better chance of getting more stimulus with higher reps, lower weight, because you're. I think you're just not gonna have the quality. I think in the lower rep range on
Mm,
average. I'm
You're
not
just,
saying always, but on average for the
you're
average
just
person.
you're just going to be more fatigued towards
Yeah.
the end of the workout. So it does make sense. Like if you've ever tried to, like let's say you go to the gym and typically you do one movement, your first or second movement, but you go to the gym that day and someone's on it. So you're like, oh, I'll just come back to it later. And then you do come back to it later and you're like, cool, let me load it up with the weight I normally do. It's like, oh, fuck, this was heavy. Like, I can't do this.
Right.
So that's where it applies. But then another thing I wanted to touch on with rep ranges is that they shouldn't and they don't have to change often. Often being maybe multiple weeks, maybe even months. But I want to get really good at progressing in movement. Because if you're constantly flipping your rep ranges around, how are you really going to build on it? If one week you're doing, one movement for 6 to 9, and then the next week you're doing like 15 to 20, and you're constantly flipping it around in there, you never really get a chance to really get good at that movement for 6 to 9, which is what's going to help drive progressive overload. So it's one of those that it's like you don't need to stay in the same rep ranges forever, and you shouldn't, but you need to give yourself enough time within prescribed rep ranges so that you can actually build upon them. Because I mean, that comes down to the entire basis of progressive overload. Because part of getting stronger on something is skill to a degree. So you need to not only be literally getting stronger, but you need to be getting better at doing the movement. So I like to keep my rep ranges. I don't have like a set amount of time, but I like to keep them relatively the same and strategically move them up or down rather than, yeah, jumping around because I'm not sitting here trying to do P90X and confuse the muscle. I can make a killing though. Let me make P90Ox. Muscle confusion.
Yeah. Also, another thing to add to your point is you want also to have the same conditions going into the exercise. uh, Keep it as similar as possible. So if you're constantly moving exercises around on your program, you're not going to actually have the same kind of you're not going to have the same experience week to week as you would if you kept the order the same and keeping the rep ranges the same. That's why a lot of training and even programming can seem kind of boring, because it's like, you pick these exercises, this order, these rep ranges, and then kind of like just see how it goes for a while. So that's another, probably, you want to standard. I think the word really is standardizing your programming. You want to standardize. And even for me, we approach, I think, warming up slightly differently, but I don't think it's not significant enough to even talk about. But even your warm-ups will help standardize your lift, because if one week you gave yourself like 2 or 3 feeder sets into a press, and then the next week you just did like one quick warm up and then went right into it, well, the standardization is now off. So you want to keep things relatively similar. And I think a good, maybe, rule of thumb is every month to every 2 months, have like a day where you reconsider your programming based on your logbook and how you've been progressing, how you feel about the exercises and everything like that. And then you could maybe change things up and then stick with it for another month or 2 months.
I just like to, you hit a good point. It can look boring. What works is not sexy. It's not cool. It's not exciting. It's doing the same exercises in the same rep ranges week in and week out for months. That's what it looks like. It is not cool. This workout, we're going to be working this cool exercise. And then our next one, this next cool exercise. We're going to constantly change it. And oh, we're going to do 6 reps today and then 30 reps. And then, oh, let's do 100 reps. Like, no, it's you do the same things almost every single lift. Your goal is, can I add another rep or can I add a little bit more weight? That is the main driver of what's going to happen. So there are a lot of people that be like, oh, it feels like I'm doing the same thing. It's like, yeah, you're going to
Bitch,
be.
you are.
You should be, but you shouldn't be doing the same thing. You should be doing a little bit more than you did last time. But it's shiny object syndrome. And it's such a
Yeah.
thing where people are just like, oh, like, I don't.
Well, yeah. Well, you actually, you lead into something I wanted to bring up, which was, when we're talking about progressing across reps and weight, for example, I think that one of the mistakes, or one mistake, or one potential mistake rather, that people make is, because you have a rep range, or you're prescribed a rep range on everything. It's like, it means that you have to now progress via the reps before you can raise the weight. That's true, I think, most of the time. But I think one caveat here is that once you start lifting some pretty serious weight, let's bring back the example of the squat, for example. The likelihood that you're going to add a rep to a 500-pound squat is way, way less likely going to happen than if you want to add 2.5 or 5 pounds to a squat. So for I'd say heavy compounds, adding weight might be a really good way of progressing on that when we're talking really, really big loads. I think when it's light, when the reps are, when the weight is slightly lighter, and I think most of the time, progressing through the rep range and then increasing the weight, like, I'd say the vast majority of time, that's probably your best bet. But I mean, I'm curious what you think about this, Ox. But then also with these really heavy stuff, it's like you might want to consider actually raising the weight more so than adding reps. What do you think of that?
That's one of the times where breaking the rules comes in. I just said that you want to not switch rep ranges around all the time and all that, but you still don't. But you can look at it as, if I was doing on squat, let's say 6 to 9 first set, second set 12 to 15. Well, maybe on that second set, I might do 10 to 12. Maybe I'm going to add a little bit more weight to what I would be doing on that second set. That way I can try to, drive more strength. Or another example of this would be, if you're doing anything more than that, and you're doing like, 8 to 12 is your rep range. Well, maybe go to a weight you can do for 6 to 9 and then see like, kind of manipulate these rep ranges to see if that's what's going to help progress. And that's why I think touched on it last episode, but I'm not totally against strategically every now and then, not often, but strategically loading it up a little bit more and going for like a triple, maybe, 3 to 5 reps instead of 6 to 9 reps every now and then. If that's the additional stimulus you need, the different kind of stimulus to help drive, this progressive overload.
Yeah, that's a little bit controversial.
I don't feel like it should be. I learned that
It
from Jordan Peters. So if
it
someone's
shouldn't
got
be.
beef with that, they can take it up
It
with
shouldn't be, but
Jordan
I'm just
Peters.
imagining a triple and I just wanna cry.
Well, you
Um,
shouldn't do it often. It should be sparingly. I'm
I haven't
talking
hit a triple in forever, man. Holy crap.
that's just to throw some raw stimulus at you. I'm talking in a 12-week training cycle, like once, twice, max, ever. Like that is not something because I don't want people to hear this and be like, oh, okay, every week I'm gonna just do. No, this is something so sparingly to add some raw novel stimulus in a different
Yeah.
way to try to break a plateau or whatever. It is not something, it is like something I use after I've exhausted. And what we'll get into is like intensity techniques. If I've exhausted intensity techniques and other things, and like I really, really want to progress this, it's like, okay, cool. Let's load up 25 pounds more than we normally would, 3 reps. And I've done it enough that
It's
I
an
can
interesting
tell you
approach, definitely.
sometimes that is, and again, I have to say sparingly,
Yeah,
capital SP, I don't know how to spell, so I'm not gonna try,
yeah.
but
I
sparingly,
I think it's really interesting, actually. That's something that, like, I think only the mind of Jordan Peters can come up with.
yeah, and that I mean, but where I'd like to do it, typically, if I need to add more of that raw stimulus, is going to be intensity techniques, which have strangely come under fire lately. I've seen
Really?
more so than ever, like drop sets are dumb.
Oh,
Like it's
oh,
only
oh,
straight sets that people use, but
yeah,
then
yeah,
we put on our thinking hats again.
yeah.
And it's like, well, let's logically think about it. I just wrote about it in my last email that what does a cluster set let us do? So on a cluster set, I'm going to pick a weight that typically I can get for 15 reps. I'm going to do that weight for 6 different sets with a 10-second rest in between. I'm going to do that for 4 reps. It's going to be really easy your first few sets. Then it's like, and once you kind of get close to that 15 number, it's like, ooh, this is getting really hard. So once you get that, and you've done all 6 of your mini sets in that cluster set, you've now gotten a weight you can normally get for 15 reps. You just got it 24 times. Sure, there was a little bit of rest in between, but you can't tell me that's not priming the body and making it stronger to be able to then for the you can get for 15 reps that if you went and tested that the next week or weeks after whatever, then now you're starting to get that for 16, 17, 18 because you're just giving it that look of what 24 reps at that weight feels.
Yeah.
Same thing with drop sets. They work a little bit differently because it's not like you're doing the same weight, you're dropping it, but you're just pushing the body. You're forcing adaptation because you're doing something that in a straight set basis it can't do. You're pushing it beyond that point. So that's another spot. And then what's the rest pause? I mean, it's the same example. You're taking a weight you could typically only get for like 6 to 8 reps, and now you just did it for 12 to 15. It's those raw stimulus, that raw just doing extra that you normally couldn't do that's going to help force an adaptive response, which it's become this thing where I'm like, oh, that's worthless.
I think the take that their straight sets are just this, like, the end all be all, it really is. It's one of these things. I'm curious if you also have this kind of instinct where it really requires you for it to be true that straight sets are the end all be all ultimate. There's no reason to do anything else besides straight sets. You have to be like kind of a devotee to low volume. Like, I'm talking low volume. I'm not talking about like your low volume or even like Dorian Yates's low volume. I'm talking about like closer to Menser low volume. And why I say that is because you start to suspect when people uh, say these things that they've never actually trained moderate volume or even high volume in their lives. And why do I say this is because anybody who's done that knows that by the end of your training session, your straight sets are just not as uh, they're not as stimulating, or they're not as effective, I should say. You're fatigued, so they're not as stimulating as they could be. Are they still probably good? Sure. But this is why putting intensity techniques, if you're going to put them in your programming, putting them towards the end of your session might be a really good idea, because the whole point is we want to train to failure or close to failure. And intensity techniques can kind of take us over the line in that way, maybe better than a poorly executed straight set. And why I brought up the low volume thing is because the only way you can get away with performing straight sets with excellent execution is if you're doing like only 5 of them or like 6 of them per session. You know what I mean? Like, so yeah, I think that in a vacuum, if you were to, in a low volume vacuum, it's like this only really makes sense.
What I think is funny, well, one, it also assumes that volume doesn't contribute to growth, that it's only, single sets to failure. That is what contributes to growth, which we already know that I am still in the camp of intensity over volume, that we want to focus more on intensity in this heavy progressive overload. But it's the volume delivered through like an intensity technique, it is going to contribute. And really what I see the argument against is like fatigue. It's creating additional fatigue. Well, if you look at the literature, the body can handle a ton, a ton, like way more than a drop set or whatever, is not pushing you so far over this line that, oh my God, you can't recover. Plus, if you're designing training intelligently, likely you're going to have deload periods too. Like even though I was training super low volume, and I have trained super low volume with like DC training, 12 to 16 weeks in, I'm taking a week deload at least, or 2 weeks deload, even on very low volume, because you just want to you want to avoid injuries, you want to stay fresh. So the argument behind it that, oh, it's just driving this much, all this fatigue and all that, it's like it's just dumb because you can handle it. Like if the difference between you making progress and recovering is a drop set or not, I'm going to have to evaluate the rest of your training and then your activity outside of the gym with your diet, sleep, and all that. Because if that is the make or break point, I'm just going to have to assume that something's really fucked up
A
with the
lot more
rest.
is wrong. Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot more is wrong.
And that's where
Uh,
the only critiques that I ever see is, oh, junk. It's
yeah,
fatigue.
yeah.
I'm like,
Well,
your
you have
body's a
like
bitch then.
you nailed it though when you said that you have to completely discount volume from the equation entirely. And this is kind of why I have a problem with, and I promise you I won't get too down. This is a whole nother podcast, but this is why I take issue with this whole idea with this saying where everybody says it and they almost say it like they regurgitate it like it's like some like nostrum, if you know what that means. Where it basically means where they'll say, you know, mechanical tension is the primary driver of hypertrophy. It's like everybody says it. And look, we might even believe that, but what the problem is with this mindless adoption of that saying, you get people who discount volume entirely. And so I try once in a while, I don't really try too hard, but once in a while I'll try to say like, well, it's kind of mechanical tension and volume, because if it was only mechanical tension, then why aren't, powerlifters the most jacked people in the world? And so it's like volume is clearly this integral part of it. So I say mechanical tension and volume. And my point really is back to what you were saying, is like you have to completely discount volume to have this ideology, which it feels like an ideology because it goes against like all of like not only common sense, but even the latest literature and all the rest, to say that, just straight set, straight set, straight set. And it's like, they're great. I love straight sets. In fact, the majority of my programs are straight sets, but it's towards the end as I approach a deload, where I'll integrate them more because fatigue accumulates across a training block. I've been told this was also not true, which is insane. But as we approach a deload, performance dips and your
Do these people
volume.
not train hard?
But that's really what it is. It feels that way, right? I mean,
Because
and train hard. I think really only because I believe these people who say these things train hard in the sense that they are driving mechanical tension, but they're just not doing a lot of it. They're just doing kind of like the bare minimum, and I
how,
just don't understand.
they would have to be right, and people like Dante Trudell would have to be wrong. Which, I mean, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of people that kind of disprove this. And his program was quite literally, you would do for a body part 2 sets, but 2 rest pause sets. So 6 points of failure. So ironically, you're only using intensity techniques anyway, but you would only have 6 points of failure maximum per week on a body part. A lot of times it's only 3 points to failure. It's 1 rest pause set. And anyone that's run it would be like, that's an amazing program. And so volume doesn't get much lower than that. Plus, with that, having run it multiple times, I promise you by weeks 12, you're like, I need a week out of the gym. I am run down. Like this is, and that's where injury and everything starts popping up more. So this idea that fatigue doesn't accumulate is, well, I don't like.
That one blew my mind. I
Are they
almost couldn't.
training?
I couldn't, but yeah,
Are
I
you
couldn't.
training?
That one. I mean, a lot of these takes from. Let's be real. These are people who start from Menser and then work their way backwards, and they might not even be into Menser himself, but they come from that mindset, and then they work their way backwards, and they kind of pick and choose the literature and the data points that kind of back up their worldview, and
Sounds
then
like keto.
yeah, it does. It sounds a lot like carnivore and keto. It really is because it's one of the things is like I come from a computer science background,
Nerd.
and what and one of the things that you discover when you start programming and learning how to program and all this is that if you can with hard coding the solution is what it's called in programming, hard coding the solution, where it's like if you're trying to get some like a program to do a certain thing, and instead of writing algorithms that make it happen in an intelligent way, you just tell it what to do directly, and that makes it a program that you press a button and it says a screen pops up and gives you that one answer. But what if you want to have different inputs or have what different sort of more complicated algorithms? Well, that hard code solution breaks down and whatever. And so anyway, when I was like listening to and observing a lot of people's especially with low volume and their training ideology, to me it was like red flag, red flag, red flag. This seems like a hard coded solution where it's like we know the solution ahead of time, which is low volume, and now we're going to make sure everything we package everything in a way that justifies it, and we're going to ignore this, we're going to put this aside and that aside, and we're going to justify this approach. And so anyway, it just jumped out at me, and one of the things that jumped out at me that really was a red flag was this whole idea that like deloads are just like this unnecessary thing that never has to happen. It's like I just what planet are you
It's
that
funny.
you've never needed a deload? Yeah.
I have a literal program that is 3 to 6 total sets per week. And so obviously I'm someone that values low volume and its applications, but I'm not so bound by it that I'm not open to the other nuances that also go into this, because there are a lot of different nuances that go into this. Even Jordan Peters, if you look at his training logs lately, is training with not what would be called high volume, but higher volume. Like these are Dante, him, and these guys are kind of like the godfathers of modern day low volume. And even their volume crept up just a little bit at times. Like it
Yeah.
modulates. Sometimes it's
Yeah.
higher, sometimes as it should. Like, or the body's not just this fixed thing that this works all the time. And like you're not looking at other effects and other contributing factors that go into growth and progress. And so it's kind of funny that like a lot of the stuff being thrown out there that's coming from eras far, far before all of this are like arguing with the pioneers of modern day lower volume training. it's just funny to see how this goes. And it comes down to, I'm not closed minded, my approaches and all that, but it's like, am I going to listen to people, yeah, like Jordan Peters, Scott Stevenson, Dante, you name it, all these guys? Am I going to listen to them, or am I going to listen to some dudes like I don't even know who they like really are, and they haven't coached thousands and thousands of people and all these bodybuilders and all these other people and got all these results? Like, who am I going to listen to? And it's like, I'm going to err on the side of decades of experience, tons of, even if you want to get technical, these guys have tons of degrees. Some of them have multiple masters in this. Plus, they have thousands of clients, tens of thousands at this point. So it's like,
They're their own case study almost.
and that's why, yeah,
And that's another thing is that, like, sometimes you'll mention, or I don't typically do this because I don't really have people that I've really like I haven't really come through any sort of like person's approach. Like, for example, like I'm not like a for you, for example, it's like Jordan Peters or whatever. But like sometimes you'll mention somebody, not you, but like me or anybody, and they'll be like, they'll just be like, oh, argument from authority. It's like, wait, but like no, but these guys actually have a lot of success and they've done this for a long time, and we kind of know that
it works.
well, we know
Like,
that it works and everything. And I guess I just there's just a lot of cope. Let's just be real.
it's
There's a lot of
just,
cope.
yeah, I mean, yeah, arguments from authority. Like, I get that. But then at the same time, like, that's assuming that like there are no smart people
Well, the
and that
difference,
there's
but hold
not
on
some
though.
people that just know more. And it's like, no, sometimes a person is an authority because they know their shit, which I don't even follow everything any of the guys I've mentioned say. I have my own opinions, but like when they say something, I listen. I'm
Yeah.
at least going to take it into my mental inventory,
Yeah.
work through
It's a
it,
data
try it
point.
out. Yeah.
Yeah. We can't have like there's no trainer that can literally like read every study and do literally do the studies themselves. You know what I mean? Like there's no person who can do this, and we have to pick and choose and take from this and take from that person, and view this person as a credible source. Like one of the problems that I think we're running into a lot lately in like all sectors of like everything is that like there's authority figures have been so questioned, and in some cases for good reason. They've been sort of, some authority figures are we're now we don't just blindly trust as much as we used to. But what's happened is there's a lot of cases where it's like an overstepping or an over application of being skeptical. And so you point to somebody with a ton of experience and a lot of success, like like Jordan Peters again, for example. It's like, and if you get someone who replies like, oh, argument from authority, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, this is a authoritative figure who's got a lot of experience under their belt, and we could see the results of all these people, and they've spoken about what they believe, and they've given her arguments for things. I found them convincing. I mean, these are all things that we all do all the time, and to pretend as though we're all conducting studies in our free time to test every single thing, it's just an absurd concept these days.
You know what's
um
funny?
yeah.
All of these guys that I mentioned at one point were like so unorthodox to what the academic authorities were saying too. So it's not like they're like, oh yes, the new study. Because if you even read different like exercise scientists and all that, like Brad Schoenfield or Schoenfield, however you pronounce it.
Yeah, right.
If you read his book on hypertrophy, you start to realize that, and it says it for like over half the things, we still don't fully understand how this works. So
Yeah.
we don't understand how all of this stuff works. But I mean, if you do it long enough, you can figure out what does work and what isn't working. So, but that's why relying on data as your sole point of reference is like, even the people that create this data, they acknowledge we don't really necessarily know all the things that go into this, which is
Yeah,
funny to me. I'm
there are
like,
gaps in our knowledge, which makes sense, and that's a normal thing too. That's not like a we have to kind of remind ourselves that like we're constantly sort of filling in the gaps of the unknown. That's a very like human thing. It's a very human experience, and we take leaps of faith all the time. And it turns out that like we kind of know a lot about training. We're always learning a bit more, but you know there are certain people we could point to and say, well, this person's had a lot of success, and I've had success, you know, using their principles. I think that wraps it up, though. I think that we've touched on a lot of really good things. We've talked about exercise selection. We've talked about stimulus to fatigue, exercise order, rep ranges. We talked a bit about volume, intensity techniques, and we even touched some social commentary on low volume, which I didn't expect to have happen. But it's always a good time to
It's
talk about
always
that.
going to be a thing because it's
Yeah,
always brought up. But I think next time we should get into. We've been talking a lot about training. We need to get into diet. I think next episode, let's get into some of the
yeah,
finer points of dieting for both fat loss, muscle growth, and then health in general, but just performance and the different nuances that go into that. Because that, now that's even more dogmatic than training, but there is definitely a good middle ground, a good.
interesting. I didn't know that it was more dogmatic because I'm fairly I'm not as well versed in this as you, so I'll be definitely learning from you. But I have some opinions of my own. But yeah, I didn't know that it was dogmatic. Oh, are we talking about like carnivore and stuff like that?
Well, yeah, just what's the best way to what's the best diet, which honestly, I
Yeah.
mean, it's pretty clear. If your goals are more fitness and performance oriented, like kind of what not the best, but better, more optimal diets look like. And you'll just have certain dogmatic groups like
Oh
carnivore
yeah,
and
yeah.
stuff be like,
Oh
no,
yeah.
no, 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 no. It's like the thing I talked about the other day about like muscle keto and muscle growth and bodybuilders and all that. And it's like, well, there's a reason there's no top bodybuilders that are keto. I'm talking top bodybuilders. I'm not talking, oh, this one guy's a bodybuilder and he's keto. No, I'm talking the best.
Or bodybuilders after they're done competing. Yeah.
Yeah. Or they switch to keto after they put on all of their muscle from carbs, but now they can more maintain their look and all that on keto. No, I'm talking like came up, one was successful and all that while keto. And that's because there's a role in carbs and muscle growth and everything, but because it's kind of like people that make this soul stance their life that it's now no 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 you can grow muscle the same way on no carb and it's like buddy buddy I need you to be real. There's millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars in bodybuilding, like the top bodybuilders, not from the shows themselves but in general being in that spotlight and everything, millions of dollars. So you think that if there was a better way to do things they wouldn't be doing it? Come on. Come on, man.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, well, I
That'll be a
digress.
good topic. I'm looking forward to that one.
We'll just start getting these out. Now that the program's out and all that, because that's what slowed us down. Now I think we want to start trying to do these even up to twice a week. So yeah,
Well, I guess with that, I just want to give a quick shout out. Everybody, give my YouTube channel a follow at Gain Trust and follow the Road to Pro series, where usually once or twice a week I'll upload a video of my gym session and some funny banter and some being goofy and training hard. It's basically the best way to put it.
and then don't follow me. Just just follow Mikey. All right. Well, everyone, you have a good week, good month of February, good year.
My birthday month. Yep. Have a
All
great
right.
rest of your day. Take care.